So the third A in the 3A's framework is ACT. And ACT is choosing an intervention that is appropriate for the level of risk, the type of risk, and the person or people at risk. So is this a low risk or high risk situation? Is it a risk of violence, a risk of suicide, a risk of unintentional injury, all of the above? And is it the person who's in your office? Is it their kid, their partner, their parent who's living with them, their workplace? Who is it who's actually at risk of firearm related harm? You can see that on this graphic, it's the most colorful one because the colors denote to some degree the level of risk shown by these various interventions. So we'll talk a little bit about each one, but the blue cooler colors are representing the lowest level of risk, and the higher, warmer colors like red are representing the high level of risk. It's important to think about this if you have somebody who you have assessed is at risk for firearm related harm and does have access to a firearm, because we know particularly for suicide that one of the most effective ways to reduce the risk of suicide is to put some time and distance between that person and their lethal means. And this is true also for violence, is that when there is a firearm involved in domestic violence incidents or people making threats of mass violence, it's much easier for that person to do harm than if there's not a firearm available. So back to the blue square on the bottom, when nobody is at imminent risk of harm, safe storage is the appropriate recommendation. That's the action that can be taken in almost all cases where somebody does have access to a firearm at home, but no one's at high risk. It's really never the wrong answer. And the goal of safe storage counseling is to just prevent firearm access by individuals who may not be authorized to use the gun, whether they're at high risk because of problematic drinking or domestic violence, or just that they're a 5-year-old kid who shouldn't be able to access the family handgun. So the safest way to store a firearm is unloaded, locked up using a locking device, separate from ammunition, and with the keys and combinations inaccessible to children or others at risk. So a lockbox that your whole family can access the keys to is not keeping that firearm out of the hands of anybody else in the household. Again, with the harm reduction approach, some of these things may not be possible, but having your firearm at least locked up with a locking device with the keys and combinations inaccessible to others at risk, even if it is loaded, is again better than having none of these components. Safe storage devices vary, and depending on the budget and the types and numbers of guns that somebody might want to store and whether or not they want the safe storage option to be portable. There are lock boxes, gun safes, cable locks, and trigger locks. There's more information about this on our website. You can check out our safe storage that talks about some of the advantages and disadvantages of each type. But again, this is part of having that tailored solution that's individualized for your individual patient, so that, depending on what the guns are there for, how quickly they might want to access them, who else is in the household, they may be better suited for a gun safe than a cable lock. And that's part of being informed also, is being able to have those conversations with them. Sometimes that's not enough. And the person who owns the firearms or who would have access to the box or the safe may be the person at risk. And in a little bit higher level of risk time, the firearms might best be removed from home during a time of crisis. And this is called a temporary transfer of firearms. It's a higher risk option, somebody who might be, considering ending their life or having intermittent thoughts about hurting somebody at work, but they're willing to work with you, they have insight, and they're willing to collaborate and remove the firearms from the home. In some places, background checks may be required. In California, in situations where the firearm is being transferred out of the home of somebody who's suicidal, there is a sort of waiver for the background check in that particular situation. But this is one of those things you might want to be informed about your policies in your own state before you make those recommendations. And in some places, temporary voluntary storage is also available at retailers or gun ranges, or even with law enforcement agencies. So those are two actions you can take that are collaborative and where you can work with the patient, but sometimes in really high risk situations where the patient's not willing to or able to collaborate, an emergency intervention may be necessary. So the two emergency interventions we talk about, one is mental health holds. And mental health holds have sort of a specific purpose. They do provide for a temporary separation from lethal means like firearms, and they can connect the person to mental health treatment for any underlying condition that's contributing to their risk. So for example, depression that's contributing to their risk of suicide, or psychosis that's contributing to their risk of violence. But this involuntary mental health hold allows for temporary, in California, it allows for temporary removal of a gun only if it's in a person's possession when they're detained. That means like if the police show up at their house and they're actually holding the weapon making threats. If that person goes into a hospital and says, I'm feeling suicidal, and they get put on a mental health hold, they may have a whole gun safe full of firearms at their house, but no one's really going to know about that. And it's not part of the process that somebody would necessarily go get them unless other things happen further down the road. So it's important to know that while a mental health hold can provide a temporary separation between the person and their firearms, it's not going to trigger a prohibition until the patient is admitted to, or in some places actually committed by hearing to the psychiatric hospital. So it doesn't guarantee that after their discharge, they won't have continued access to firearms, especially if it's a short mental health hold with sort of emergency treatment and then they're released. In those situations, you may want to consider an adjunctive civil protective order. And these orders are also appropriate for people who are making threats or having ideation, but may not meet criteria for a mental health hold. So an example is somebody who wants to kill somebody else or hurt somebody at their place of work as an act of revenge that's not due to any kind of mental illness. In those situations, protective orders that can remove that person's access to guns and prohibit them from buying more guns may be the best intervention. But these, again, can also be used adjunctively with mental health holds. Another high risk, another involuntary action people can take in times where they're very, very concerned. There are a number of types of civil protective orders, none of which require any kind of criminal activity to have been committed or require any kind of mental health diagnosis. And depending on the particular situation, you may consider a domestic violence restraining order, an extreme risk protection order known here in California as gun violence restraining orders, a workplace protective order, or school violence protective order.